The morning of Genevieve's first chemotherapy session, Craig was boarding a flight to Vancouver. She had driven herself to Kingston General before sunrise, because the appointment was at 7, and she had told herself the early start would make the whole thing feel more manageable, more ordinary. She wore the gray cardigan she had bought specifically for hospital visits, soft enough not to irritate the port they had placed beneath her collarbone 2 weeks earlier, and she carried a canvas bag with a water bottle, a paperback she wouldn't read, and a pair of wool socks because someone from the support group had warned her the infusion suite was always cold. The nurse who set up her IV was cheerful and unhurried. She explained each bag as she hung it, told Genevieve what to watch for, tucked a warm blanket across her lap without being asked. The suite had 6 recliners arranged in a half circle. 2 other patients were already settled in. One woman was knitting. The man beside her was asleep. Genevieve looked at the empty chair beside her own. She had told Craig the appointment was at 7. She had mentioned it twice the week before, and once again the morning he left, standing in the kitchen while he rolled his golf bag toward the front door. He had nodded. He had said, "You'll be fine, Jen. The doctors know what they're doing." He had kissed her on the cheek and told her he'd be back Sunday night. That had been 4 days ago. Her phone showed one text from Craig, sent the previous evening from Whistler. "Dinner was incredible out here. Miss you. Call when you can." She had read it 3 times and then set the phone face down on the nightstand. The infusion took just under 4 hours. Genevieve watched the clear liquid move through the line and tried to concentrate on the audiobook playing through her earbuds. Twice she had to stop and take slow breaths through her nose because the smell of the antiseptic the nurse used made her stomach turn. The woman across the room, the knitter, caught her eye at one point and gave a small, knowing nod. That was the entirety of the human contact she had that morning. At 11:40, a nurse helped her out of the chair and walked her toward the discharge area. Genevieve buttoned her cardigan slowly because her fingers had gone clumsy. She signed the sheet the nurse held out and listened to the aftercare instructions she had already memorized. "Is someone picking you up?" the nurse asked. Genevieve reached for her coat. "I'll get a cab." The nurse paused, then wrote down the number for the hospital taxi service without comment. Some answers told you everything you needed to know, without saying very much at all. Outside, the October air was sharp. Genevieve sat on the bench beside the main entrance and waited. She was nauseous in a way that had nothing to do with the medication, a cold, hollow feeling that had started the moment Craig's flight disappeared from the departures board on her phone. She had not told her friends yet. She had not told her mother, who lived in Sudbury and worried about everything, because she hadn't wanted to be a source of worry before she had any answers. She had told Craig 8 weeks earlier, the evening after the oncologist confirmed the diagnosis, sitting at the kitchen table with the printed report between them. Craig had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said, "The Whistler trip is already paid for, Jen. Non-refundable. It's only a long weekend." And she had sat across from him and felt something she couldn't name settle into the space where she had expected something else to be. The cab pulled up and she got in and looked out the window the whole drive home. Pearl was at her aunt's place. Genevieve had arranged it before the appointment because she hadn't known how she would feel afterward, and she had been right not to guess. When she got home, the house was quiet in the way that felt different from ordinary quiet, the way empty rooms feel when you are not well and there is no one else inside them. She made it to the bathroom before she was sick. She sat on the floor for a while after, one hand pressed against the cold tile. Then she washed her face, went to the bedroom, and called her Aunt Rowena. Rowena answered on the second ring. "I had my first treatment this morning," Genevieve said. A brief pause. "I know, I've been thinking about you all day." Another pause. "Where's Craig?" Genevieve looked at the ceiling. Whistler. The silence that followed had a particular quality to it, not surprise exactly, but something heavier. "I'm coming over," Rowena said. "You don't have to." "I'm coming over, Jenny." Rowena lived on the other side of Kingston, in the house she had kept after her husband passed, 3 blocks from the lake. She arrived 40 minutes later carrying a bag of groceries and a thermos of ginger broth she had made that morning without mentioning it to anyone. She let herself in with the spare key Genevieve had given her years ago and found Genevieve sitting at the kitchen table in her coat, still holding the canvas bag. She set the groceries down. She sat across from her niece and did not immediately say anything. She simply waited. "I can't do this here," Genevieve said finally. In this house, the way things are. Rowena looked at her steadily. Then don't. It was as simple as that. Not permission exactly. More like confirmation of something Genevieve had already known. She had known it in the cab on the way home, and probably before that. Somewhere in the 4 hours she had spent alone in that reclining chair, with a warm blanket a stranger had tucked across her lap. She packed 2 bags that afternoon. Pearl's things first. The small purple suitcase they used for trips to Sudbury, stuffed with her favorite pajamas, the stuffed elephant named Bramble, her library books due the following week, then her own. Enough clothes to last through the next treatment cycle, her medications, the folder of medical documents she had organized into a binder, because that was the kind of thing Genevieve did when she felt the rest of her life slipping sideways. Rowena carried the heavier bag without being asked. Genevieve carried Pearl's purple suitcase and the cardigan she had folded back into the canvas bag. She did not leave a note. Craig called from the airport Sunday night. She let it ring through. He called again an hour later and she answered and told him in a calm, even voice where she was. What do you mean you're at Rowena's? I mean I packed a bag and Pearl and I are staying with Rowena for a while. She heard him exhale. Jen, I know you're upset. I know the timing was, I should have thought it through better. I get that. His voice carried the particular tone he used when he believed a reasonable explanation would resolve things. I'll come by tomorrow and we can talk. You can come by, she said, but I need you to know that I'm not coming home. A longer silence. You're not serious. She looked over at Rowena's living room, where Pearl was already asleep on the pull-out couch with Bramble tucked under her arm. I am. She ended the call. She did not cry. She sat on the edge of Rowena's guest bed and felt the hollow space in her chest slowly fill with something else. Not relief exactly, but the first faint outline of it. Craig arrived the following evening with flowers from the grocery store, and an expression that telegraphed wounded sincerity. Genevieve met him at the front door. She did not invite him inside. I made a terrible mistake, he said. I know that. The trip was wrong. I should have been there with you. Genevieve looked at him. The flowers were chrysanthemums, yellow ones, her least favorite, though she had never said so in 8 years of marriage. You knew my appointment was at 7, Craig. I did, he said. I just thought. What did you think? He looked past her into the house. That you'd manage. That you'd be okay. She nodded once. I did manage. That's not the point. She pulled her cardigan closer. I need some time. How much time? She considered the question honestly. Enough time to know what I want to do next. He left the flowers on the step. She brought them inside after he drove away and put them in water, because Pearl would like them, and because it seemed wasteful not to. Rowena said nothing about the flowers. She made tea and they sat together at the kitchen table after Pearl had gone to bed, not talking very much, just occupying the same warm room, and that was enough. Genevieve had her second treatment 3 weeks later, and her third after that. Rowena drove her each time, dropped her at the entrance, went to run errands, came back to collect her when she texted. On the third visit, Genevieve noticed the physiotherapist. He worked at the cancer center 2 mornings a week, running a program for patients managing fatigue and muscle stiffness during treatment. She had seen him in the corridor before but hadn't paid attention. This time, he stopped by her recliner with a small paper cup of ginger tea, set it on the side table without fanfare, the way you might set down something that simply belonged there. Tends to help with the nausea from the second bag, he said. Take it or leave it. Then he moved on to check on the man, sleeping in the corner chair. His name was Matteo. She learned that from the lanyard he wore, printed in the same font the hospital used for all its staff badges. She did not introduce herself. He did not ask. By the 4th visit, the ginger tea was already steeping on the side table before she sat down. She didn't ask who had left it. She drank it. It helped. He was not loud about his kindness. That was what she noticed first. He moved through the suite without performance, checking in on patients with the same unhurried attention he might give to a difficult task that simply required care. Once, when her IV line kinked and she couldn't reach the call button, he was beside her in under a minute, repositioning the line with hands that were matter-of-fact and steady, explaining each step in plain language without making her feel anxious about it. After her 5th session, she was sick in the corridor bathroom on the way out. He was there when she emerged, not waiting dramatically, just present, leaning against the wall with a damp paper towel in one hand and a glass of water in the other. He handed both to her without comment. You don't have to do that, she said. I was already nearby, he said, which was probably true. She drank the water and they stood in the corridor until the worst of the dizziness passed. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He didn't suggest she sit down or offer to call someone. He simply stayed until it was clear she could walk, and then walked beside her toward the exit, without making it obvious that he was making sure she reached it. Rowena was parked outside. Genevieve got in and didn't mention Mateo. There was nothing to mention. He was a physiotherapist who was good at his job. That was all. Craig signed the separation papers in December, 2 weeks before Christmas, and did not make it easy. He arrived at the lawyer's office with his own counsel and an expression that still suggested the situation was reversible. When Genevieve slid the papers toward his side of the table, he looked at them for a long time before looking at her. "You're really doing this," he said. "Yes. Over a trip, a long weekend." Genevieve folded her hands on the table. "Not over the trip. The trip was the last thing in a long list of things. But I don't need you to agree with that." His lawyer murmured something quietly. Craig looked out the window. Finally, he picked up the pen. His parents called the following week. His mother, Darlene, arrived at Rowena's with Craig's father, Philip, an hour after texting that she was coming. They sat in the living room with their coats still on while Rowena took Pearl to the kitchen to help ice the shortbread she had been making. "We want to talk about Pearl," Philip said. Genevieve waited. A child her age needs both parents under one roof. He leaned forward. "Genevieve, you're unwell. You're going through something very serious. This is not the time for permanent decisions." "I made this decision before I was unwell," she said. "Being unwell just made it harder to keep pretending I hadn't." Darlene looked at her with something softer than what Philip was offering. "He's her father." "He is. That won't change." Genevieve looked at the wall, then back at them. "But Pearl has everything she needs here." Philip stood and began buttoning his coat. "You're being short-sighted." Genevieve rose, too. "I've spent most of this marriage being the opposite of short-sighted. I've been planning for a future that was never going to arrive." She moved toward the hallway. "I think we're finished here." From the kitchen came the sound of Pearl laughing about something, and the warm, particular smell of butter and vanilla that Rowena produced every December without fail. Genevieve stood in the doorway and listened to it for a moment after Craig's parents left. She was still standing there when Rowena appeared with flour on her sleeve and a small crooked smile. "Shortbread's ready when you are." January brought Pearl's 5th birthday and Genevieve's last scheduled infusion. The final scan came back clear on a Wednesday morning in late February. Genevieve was sitting in the oncologist's office with Rowena beside her, and Pearl on her lap drawing horses on the back of an appointment reminder card. And the oncologist said the words, "No evidence of active disease." And Genevieve sat very still for a moment, while everything caught up with her. Pearl looked up. "Why are you crying, Mama?" Genevieve pressed her face against Pearl's hair, "Because something really good happened." Pearl went back to her horses. "Okay," she said, satisfied. Rowena reached over and squeezed Genevieve's hand once, firmly, the way you do when words would only slow things down. Genevieve went back to work the following month. She was a librarian at the Kingston Frontenac Public Library, the Central Branch, the big limestone building on Johnson Street, and she had been on medical leave since October. Her manager, a steady woman named Phyllis, had held her position and greeted her return with a careful warmth that Genevieve appreciated precisely because it didn't make a production of anything. The first week was disorienting. Her hands knew where everything went, but her body felt like it was operating on a slight delay, like a radio tuned fractionally off the station. She moved slower than she remembered. She tired in the afternoon in a way that was new. One day she sat in the staff room for 10 minutes longer than her break allowed, and when she went back to the reference desk, Phyllis handed her a coffee and asked whether the new periodical order had arrived yet. It hadn't. Genevieve checked. It hadn't. By the second week, the delay was less noticeable. By the third, she stopped tracking it. Mateo had left the Cancer Center program in January. Budget restructuring. Rowena had heard from the woman who ran the support group. He was at a physiotherapy clinic on Princess Street now, and Genevieve knew this, only because she walked past it on her lunch break one Wednesday and saw his name on the placard beside the door. She didn't go in. There was nothing to go in for. He came into the library 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon, and stood at the new releases display for long enough that it was clear he wasn't in a hurry. He found her at the reference desk. I heard you came back, he said. Word travels, she said. Phyllis mentioned it. I drop off health magazine donations from the clinic sometimes. He set a small stack on the counter. These are from us. She accepted them. Thank you. He lingered a moment, unhurried, the way he had always been. How are you feeling? Cleared, she said, officially. Something in his expression shifted briefly, a quiet openness that came and went. That's good news. It is. He thanked her and left. She watched him go, and then went back to cataloging new fiction, and thought that there was something she had missed about his particular quality of stillness. The way he occupied space without filling it unnecessarily. He came back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. By May, the Tuesday visits had extended to occasional Saturday mornings at the farmers market on Springer Market Square. Not by arrangement, the first time it happened, they arrived at the same produce stand at the same moment and ended up walking the rest of the market together, because it was the obvious thing to do. Pearl came with them one Saturday. She had been cautious around Mateo at first. She had her mother's habit of observing before deciding. She stood close to Genevieve's leg and studied him across the vegetable stand. He bought 2 bags of early-season carrots, handed her one without asking whether she wanted it, and continued the conversation he was already having with Genevieve about the best way to store garlic over winter. Pearl looked at the carrots. She bit one. She appeared to arrive at a private conclusion. The next Saturday, she walked on his side. There was a moment at the market in June. A small thing, barely worth noting, when Pearl's shoelace came undone near the entrance, and Mateo crouched down and tied it before Genevieve had finished reaching for her. Pearl waited, patient and entirely trusting, then thanked him in the distracted way of a 5-year-old who has already moved on mentally to the next thing she wants to look at. He stood back up and they kept walking, and Genevieve thought, this is the kind of person who notices what needs doing without being asked to look. Craig exercised his access visits consistently through the summer, which Genevieve had never doubted he would. He was better with Pearl than he had been with the marriage. More present, more focused. She was glad for it. Whatever had failed between the two of them had never been about Pearl, and she refused to make it so. One Saturday in July, Craig arrived to collect Pearl and pulled up behind the familiar dark green pickup truck parked along the curb. He said nothing until Pearl had run inside for her backpack, and then he looked at the truck and then at Genevieve. He comes around a lot, Craig said. He does. A pause. Should I be worried? Genevieve looked at him steadily. About what? He didn't answer that directly. He looked at the truck again, then back at her face. You seem different. I am different, she said. I've had a year that would make anyone different. Pearl came back through the front door, talking about wanting ice cream, and Craig gathered her up and drove away, and Genevieve stood on the front steps for a moment before going back inside. That evening, Craig called. His voice was careful and controlled in the way it only got when he was working to stay that way. I want to understand what's happening, he said. Genevieve stood at the kitchen window, looking at the maple in the backyard, which was still fully green and would stay that way for another 2 months. I told you clearly in December, she said. Nothing has changed. You're moving on, he said. It wasn't a question. Craig, she kept her voice even. I moved on a long time before December. I just didn't know how to say it yet. She paused. You have a daughter who loves you. Be there for that. That's the part that still matters. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he doesn't know us. No, she said. He knows me. That's different. She ended the call gently and put the kettle on, and the kitchen felt very calm. In August, Mateo stayed for dinner for the first time. It had not been planned. He had stopped by to return a library book. Pearl had left in his truck after the market, and Rowena appeared in the kitchen doorway and said there was enough soup for everyone, which there always was. He helped Rowena carry the bowls. He listened to Pearl's involved and only partially coherent account of the butterfly she had observed at the park. He argued with Rowena about whether you needed stock or just water for the base of corn chowder. She said stock firmly, and he said water if the corn was sweet enough, and neither of them conceded, which Rowena seemed to find more entertaining than annoying. Genevieve watched them argue and felt something loosen in her chest that had been quietly contracted for a long time. After dinner, she walked with him to the front porch while Rowena put Pearl to bed. The evening was warm, the kind of August night that made the air smell like cut grass and something faintly metallic from the lake a few streets over. "Can I say something?" Matteo asked. "Yes." He turned toward her. He had the habit of choosing words carefully, not slowly, just with the kind of care that suggested he thought words were worth getting right. "I've been finding reasons to be nearby for a while now," he said. "I don't want to keep doing that." She looked at him. "I'd rather just be here," he said, "if that's something you want." The porch light was on. Inside, she could hear Rowena's voice, low and unhurried, reading to Pearl in the particular cadence she used for bedtime. Genevieve had spent most of the past year measuring the distance between where she was and where she had expected to be by now. Standing on the porch in the August dark, she realized she had stopped measuring. "That's something I want," she said. He didn't make it dramatic. He simply shifted slightly, closing the space between them in the ordinary way of two people who have decided to stop standing apart. She leaned against the porch railing, and he stood beside her, and they looked out at the quiet street together, and it didn't feel like the beginning of anything requiring announcement. It felt like arriving somewhere she hadn't known she was headed toward. October came around again, a year from that first cold morning in the infusion suite, with the particular blue sky that Kingston produced in autumn, bright and thin and honest about what it was. Pearl started kindergarten and came home with drawings of her classroom that Genevieve put on the refrigerator with magnets shaped like maple leaves. Rowena's garden was put to bed for the winter. Matteo came for dinner on Tuesdays and Saturdays and sometimes Sundays, and nobody made a remark about how regular it had become, because it had simply become regular the way things do when they fit without forcing. One Thursday evening, Pearl was in the bath, and Genevieve was putting away the last of the dishes when Matteo knocked and came in with a bag of apples he had picked up from an orchard on his way over. He set them on the counter and was about to say something when they both heard Pearl, from the bathroom down the hall, calling out, "Matteo, can you come read the octopus one? Mama already does all the voices wrong." Genevieve stood with a pot in her hand and looked at the hallway. Matteo looked at her with the question in his face. She set the pot down. She gestured toward the hall. He went. She heard Pearl explain, with great authority, the correct voice for each octopus character, and heard Matteo agree to the terms, and then heard him begin the story with an octopus voice that was, objectively, quite good. She stood in the kitchen and listened. Through the window, October had settled over the yard, the maple at the back fence gone entirely orange, the bird feeder Rowena had put up in the spring still receiving visitors. Everything outside was changing the way it was supposed to, at the pace it was supposed to, without being asked to hurry or explain itself. She filled the kettle and turned it on. A year ago, she had driven herself to a hospital in the dark and sat in a chair with a warm blanket a stranger had placed across her lap. She had carried herself through every appointment that followed, through the separation in the papers and Craig's parents in their coats, through the final scan and the first week back at the reference desk, when her hands remembered what her body was still catching up to. She had not done it without help. Rowena had been beside her for all of it, and that was not a small thing. It was the thing that had made every other thing possible. But the weight of the year had been hers to carry, and she had carried it, and she was still standing. From the bathroom came the sound of Pearl laughing at something, and Matteo saying something back, and Pearl laughing again, louder. Genevieve poured 2 mugs of tea and brought them to the table and sat down to wait, and for the first time in a very long time, waiting felt like something she was genuinely looking forward to.